Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I hope that you are all doing well. This is the start of a debut series with myself and Mr. Dimes, truly from the Blood Satellite podcast, called Do You Even Read? Maybe a monthly or quarterly literature review of sorts, because Dimes and I have a really good time when we talk about books, and we kind of want to have definitive but accessible takes and breakdowns of the literature that we're reading. But before I go any further, welcome, Dimes. How are you?
I'm doing great. I'm so happy to be here. And yeah, in the past, when we've covered books, I think my favorite one of the best things I think I've ever done was our three-parter on what went wrong. I believe it's a three-parter. And really, like, that's something you can point to, I think, to really understand the history of Black-Jewish relations, probably in the history of mankind.
Yeah, that's probably one of my favorite things that I don't have on YouTube, but
I know.
probably one. Yeah, it was a lot of fun when we covered it. So
It's a series that you have to earn to see it.
That is true. Although if you want to go find it on Rumble or Odyssey, it's certainly out there for you. But no, we're gonna do something a little bit different. Well, no, we're really not, but we are. But um, we're going to cover a text that has fascinated the crap out of the both of us since we discovered its existence and what it's about. And we're going to be covering, it might be three parts, just like the last one that you and I did for a deep book review of. But we are going to cover Thomas Moynihan's Spinal Catastrophism, a secret history or hidden history. And we're going to try our best to cover it in a way that is accessible and in a way that I think applies to a lot of the other philosophers and theory that we have read. And this is the second schizoanalysis stream that I've done today, because if you were following me earlier, I was live on Oren McIntyre's channel breaking down Nick Land's meltdown from his CCRU days. So if you had fun with that, we're going to do more of this.
It'd be so cool if we got that sort of crowd into this video eventually. Like, we just graduate them all along the pathway until they're just sad and insane like us.
Well, thankfully, we are. I'm happy, but, I'm also insane.
You know, Prude, I'm a little twisted myself.
Nothing of an autistic retard myself. I totally understand.
that meltdown essay is a lot of people's introduction to this sort of thing, and it's good that you bring that up because all this is connected. And what's interesting is I had Spinal Catastrophism by Thomas Moynihan on my list of books just because it sounded interesting. And I just like collecting stuff like that. Say, oh, it's some weird thing about spines, about how spines are evil or something. And I've had it for months and I never opened it up. And the moment I did, I started seeing references to Nick Land, the CCRU, and all these other authors. And I began to learn that, oh, this is just part of some bizarre expanded universe of thought that you start discovering it over time. So a lot of people, it's that meltdown essay and you think, wow, that's pretty wild, but then you'll just keep encountering it in the strangest places.
Yeah, absolutely. You'll always find bizarre overlaps to texts or to ideas that you would never thought would overlap in your previous readings, and then all of a sudden they do. So, for instance, to see Chardin in this text, for instance, a French Catholic writer and philosopher who I believe is a Jesuit priest during his lifetime, and he was talking about like Christogenesis and sort of the potential future and cosmology. And of course, we get the Big Bang from a lot of his works and writings. And so to see it overlap here, and then you have sort of the infamous discussion over Emmanuel Velikovsky, and then of course the references to Plutonics and Geotrauma and all this other CCRU stuff. For me, I wanted to read this just because this was a beautiful idea, because I've been interested in trying to map out concepts. This text kind of inspired me, and I'll eventually publish it, but I say that for a lot of pieces. But it has a lot of stuff to do with just mapping out. There are events that occur in political history that shape our ideology. Like, we can see the orthodoxies and sort of like right wing or left wing or accelerationist or postmodernist ideas in politics that I think are genuinely shaped by things well outside our control. I mean, for instance, on the online right, you have the trauma of, say, Charlottesville in 2017, or seeing that echo throughout J6. Now you have people who are very much adamantly against any sort of real life protest or anything like that, which there is reason to be concerned about. But I think that you can map these histories of ideology based on the trauma of external political events with reality. And we kind of see this today in this book and in this text about the spine and trauma and pain and growth and evolution. And this stuff just tickles my fancy to no end. And this is the stuff that Dimes and I are into. And this is what we're going to talk about tonight.
Yeah, and you mentioned trauma there, and I think this topic can only really be explored from people with left-wing priors or people with Marxist priors, which a lot of these proponents would be. And a lot of really interesting ideas come from that sphere, even though certainly we wouldn't count ourselves as leftists. But the preoccupation with trauma is very familiar to Marxist literature, and we don't really get into that on the right wing. We try and overcome trauma, we try to withstand it, we try to ignore it or pretend it's not real, but it really sits at the center, in my opinion, of a lot of post-left thinking. And I do think it's real, and trauma in the sense of something that impacts you and persists, and you might be able to control your reaction to it. But the idea of, you get into the Hegelian dialectics of it, of conflict being at, like, existence is the tension itself between these opposing forces. But what you'll find in a lot of these writings is, Marxist priors and leftist priors. I'm not afraid of that, and I think you can get lost in this stuff. And we were talking beforehand about entering into this labyrinth, this sort of ideological labyrinth. You don't even necessarily need to believe it. I remember I was on Jay Burden's show once, and we were talking about Foucault. And who likes Foucault? No one likes spines. No one likes Foucault, of course. However, there's interesting ideas that can be apprehended by these bizarre, twisted minds. And I think if you are confident enough in your beliefs, your faith, your ideology, whatever it might be, you can dissect these ideas and not lose your mind or lose your soul in them, because this isn't something I think people should take. They shouldn't inhabit this frame of mind too much, because I think it will drive you insane. However, you should interface with it. I think that's important, because it's really the only, it's a distinctly 21st century ideology. That's I've made that claim before, but that's what's so interesting about this. I think something like this could only have emerged in a truly 21st century context.
Well, and as I mentioned this on Oren's channel when we were going through some of Land's stuff, is that, Deleuze didn't call himself a Marxist, but you have to use this language. And I think that when you read, say, Anti-Oedipus or A Thousand Plateaus, what you are seeing is sort of this explicit application of their beliefs or their view of the world to the existing structuralist or even sort of like this Freudian dualism that, we see Freud and Marx apply their ideas to, say, Adam Smith. And so I think that we have to use the language that exists today and come up with new terms, because we don't have accurate or fully spaced out and fleshed out models for the 21st century in politics or in theory in general. We're getting there. I think we're going to see a lot of the works that have been written in the late 20th century, I think, will be used as the springboard for the philosophy of the 21st that won't really be explored until perhaps the 22nd, if humanity makes it that far. But I think that when you read stuff like this, I think what you're also witnessing are people trying to comprehend the world in a way that is counterfactual, but also I think enters that weird zone of demarcation. There are many people that would consider this stuff to be just objective pseudoscience, but I think that that's also what makes this interesting, is because there are these nuggets of objective truth, but also philosophy that is still well cited. Like the first section, before you really get into the nitty gritty of what is spinal catastrophism, is a big breakdown of Kantian philosophy alongside the classical understanding of our form and what it means to have an anterior view, or what does it mean to have bilateral symmetry along the spine. Citing the classics and the great philosophers of the previous eras.
We're
And
all obsessed
yeah.
with spines. Like spines keep coming up.
They do
in the works of these people, which is it's kind of baffling but there's evidence in the book quoting their preconception of spines, and I thought that was cool.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Like all these things sort of overlap and intersect with one another, which was particularly interesting, all the way from Aristotle all the way to references to Schopenhauer to Nietzsche. I mean, it's really some interesting overlaps that aren't even directly related. They just happen to all reference the spine.
Also, I just want to call attention to a comment here by C.G. Constantine. I wish I had the drug the author used, Mr. Anxiety Floppa correctly identifies that drug was meth.
Well, there you go. You're gonna have a good time reading this text with some drugs, but we did it stone cold sober. We raw dogged this text.
We got Tuesday here saying, I gave up listening to T777 on the 2-Bit podcast to be here. Sorry, Jason. The schizoanalysis get the girl.
That is true. Sorry, autists. Real schizos get the girl. But so before we get really too far into the book itself, there are a lot of terms that I feel are really important to cover before you can even really address this text. And we sort of made references to Land in the CCRU. If you've read this book, then you are going to know that the preface, called a Plutarchian coda, which is a great way to reference Plutarch in his writings, but also a lovely reference to a condition of the spine. So we're going to have a real fun time with a lot of these, cauda equina syndrome, a bundle of nerves at the end of the spinal cord. Basically just...
If you like spines, this is a great book.
If you like back pain, and if you want to get some back pain, this is the way to do it. But no, the preface is written by, I want to say it's Ian Hamilton Grant, it's Ian Hamilton Grant. And he is, you can see his work over at the CCRU. He was in Swarm 2, which of course Swarm 1 has the infamous meltdown essay by Nick Land. And while there are references to Land's work in the chapter titles and some of the things that he's written, you'll notice that a lot of these guys will cite pretty much everything written before 2008 from Mr. Land, for obvious reasons, because Nick has gone radically to the right, and they'll kind of disavow him as a fascist. But in that respect, I think that it's just interesting to see these philosophical overlaps in here. The preface, however, and this is what I'll kind of get into, because I know that you didn't read it or that you skipped over it, but I think that it's a few pages long, but it's particularly interesting because it sort of talks about what we're going to get into. He references, of course, the Aristotelian idea of form. The birds never fly backwards or tail first, but also that we're going to see progressive ascent into how we develop in our bones and in our forms and in our bodies. And this, of course, references all sorts of things from, Lovecraftian Orphism to the Great Circle, which, of course, we can actually depict in our images about what the Great Circle is, or potentially just being the celestial meridian, which I'll put up on screen here real quick. And again, this stuff is really it's sort of important to cover, because there's going to be a lot of terms that even when I was reading through it earlier, last month, and then also rereading just the first section today, I was still pausing and making sure my notes had the right definition alongside ways in which I could understand it, or having accessible literature to reference in here. But we're going to look at this idea about what is Thomas Moynihan referring to. And to do that, I think we have to reference what do we mean by catastrophism. And the book itself will get into it, but I think that it's kind of important to get a good idea of what we're going to dive into.
Yeah, believe it or not, people, this image will make sense later.
I promise.
And also, I wanted to mention one thing. Thomas Moynihan, the author, I don't know what possessed me to believe this, but whenever I read books like this, I always think of, what was that? Capitalist Realism. Who's the guy who wrote the Mark Fisher?
Mark Fisher.
I think of Mark Fisher, a man who's no longer with us. So for some reason, I always assume the men who write these books are deceased. And I was shocked and mortified to learn that he's still alive. Thomas Moynihan, he's out there. He
wrote a new book.
Yeah, and I don't like it. We shouldn't be reading books from guys who are just around. That's so, that I learned that after I'd read it, obviously, but it is troubling that, we could get him on the show, but it would hit different if he was dead. I'm not sure if anyone agrees, but I bet most do.
Unironically, y'all need to read Anti-Oedipus. You should, at least to help understand this text. I've read it. It's been a few years since I've gone through it. But we're going to cover that for the next episode of this sort of series that we're going to do. If I read the book in reverse, will it make my back pain go away? No, it will make it worse.
It'll make it worse, and that's good because, as you will learn, you are back pain.
Yes. You are trying to escape back pain. You are trying to escape life and the perception of time. But we'll get into that as we go on. So I guess as a backdrop, and I'm going to keep this image up here just to mess with you guys. You kind of need to take a look at the theories of evolution. So you're going to have this great debate that had taken place over the course of the 20th and the 19th, and actually even more recently up into the 1980s, about catastrophism versus uniformitarianism. And I'm going to try and condense this as quickly as I can, but I feel like it's important to break down where these ideas come from. So you have sort of the Darwinian perspective, and of course you have sort of creationist perspective on things. But catastrophism itself is going, I just misspelled that, so I can catastrophism, thank you, before I totally screw up my life here. It's the theory or the idea in geology, and of course it has neo-catastrophism, which is sort of what we're going to look into more today. From Georges Cuvier about the idea from the 19th century and the early 1800s, basically saying that life in Earth's history, especially on the geological record, has been shaped by sudden, short-lived, violent events, possibly worldwide in scope. So rather than slow incremental changes, such as millions of years of tectonic plates moving or erosion or sort of gradualism, actually, things had happened that were more likely, such as, say, references to major floods or the massive amounts of volcanic eruptions that had been potentially, and had a lot of literature prior to the discovery of the Chicxulub crater in the Yucatan Peninsula in the Gulf of Mexico, to sort of be a cause of the death of the dinosaurs, right? You have the death of the behemoths through volcanic eruptions, creating a winter, which created famine-like conditions that would lead to their destruction. And so you have all sorts of things, whether it be the Great Chain of Being or hylomorphism, which of course comes from Aristotle, which gets mentioned a lot actually in this text, whether not really necessarily directly, but sometimes indirectly. You have vitalism, which also gets referenced, the basically, life force in the embryo, which of course then gets referenced that the embryo itself reflects previous forms in a being's creation or its iterations. Of course, theistic or methodological naturalism, which is sort of, the intelligent design or creation.
Yeah, and that the being going through previous forms throughout his life, that's a big idea that really gets developed later. Mm-hmm. And what I like about just what you're saying, to also summarize it, because sometimes it always helped me, it's that if you look at it from this perspective, what makes catastrophism distinct is that evolution itself takes on the characteristic of being suddenly violent. It's just a chain. Instead of like a slow, gradual evolution, it's just bang, bang, and that's a violent in its nature. So that means the nature of the universe is inherently punishing and violent.
Yeah, exactly. And so there's this, it's violent, it's bloody, and that violence shapes us. And this is where you get sort of the long standing form of time to understand trauma on sort of like a genetic level, but also a genetic memory type level. So when you want to talk about, for instance, to make a really crappy reference, but one I think that people might understand, for those who are aware of 343 Industries' terrible handling of, say, like the Halo cannon, you'll get like, oh, well, the engineers, the librarian implemented a chaos or some kind of like coding inside of our genetic material to allow us to evolve, to create these important technologies at various points in our human history so we could survive and inherit the mantle of responsibility. Okay, but take that literally within the frame of reference of catastrophic events shape our genetic structure, our bone structure, through these violent, traumatic events throughout history. And now we are evolving to literally escape that trauma, to escape life itself.
Yes, and that is what he says intelligence is. Intelligence is merely a evolutionary tool to predict future trauma. So intelligence, human intelligence as we know it, and he puts human intelligence aside from animal intelligence, but human intelligence only exists in its current form to predict future trauma and to avoid it. So it's trying to outsmart the trauma, and that's why we are the way we are today, according to this.
Yeah, and I think that this is important in reference towards gradualism, or the evolutionary ideas that are commonly held in the respected fields of geology, archaeology, paleontology, and the rest. But, this sort of anthropological aspect. Also, you'd see this in anthropology and sociology as well, that violent sudden events such as Krakatoa, or even which other genetic bottlenecks in human history get referenced, the Toba eruption, or the event of our genetic bottleneck, that plays a role in how we as humans had communicated, or how we have been. And even today, as we continue to study human biodiversity, and not just in the race science sense, but I mean in the sense of how did early cultures, Proto-Indo-European, Eurasian, African, etc., how did they have the opportunity to evolve? What traumatic events had caused this, whether it be ice ages, winters, the ability to use fire or technology. A lot of thesis had shown around that what had allowed certain human populations to survive those genetic bottleneck events was responding to the trauma in a way that would allow them to clothe themselves or to make fire, which I think kind of this story, or this text, this narrative, also really conveniently overlaps with Man and Technics by Spengler, because he talks intimately that our tools, our understanding to use and manipulate the world around us, is just as much of an influence on our own evolution as our own evolution is on our tools. And he makes a great deal of time in that short work, Man and Technics, on the human hand, and how our tools and our weapons have molded us just as much as we've molded them in our evolution.
Yeah, and if
Yeah,
you're
go ahead.
familiar with McLuhan, or if you're familiar with even Jacques Ellul, now you're getting into the concept of the technique, or McLuhan with, our tools and our media are extensions of ourselves. But by employing these extensions, we inexorably change ourselves, and we have to almost numb ourselves when we do it. So, yeah, just to add on that, this connects to a lot of the other things we will have discussed on the show previously.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you're familiar with patrons especially will know that we've covered Man and Technics as a patron book club, but also both Dimes and I are big into reading McLuhan. I reference him all the time. This is sort of the stuff that we're going to see shape the world around us, but also, it also shapes the way in which we perceive the world. And there's a big emphasis on the perception in and of itself. Does that actually constitute reality or not? And we're going to see the Western idea of sort of objective science also evolve out of this.
And I would say McLuhan is the intellectual that I would have the most affection for, and I would take the most seriously. What I find interesting about stuff like this, the reason I say it's a distinctly 21st century sort of framework, it's that it's structured like an internet person would structure something. So you have a layering of philosophy and history and biology, because you're talking about this. A lot of this is just science. How does a planet form? But then you layer occult stuff on top of that, and then you start layering science fiction on top of that. And so it's just a stack of like your average day browsing the internet as a terminally online white guy. It's all of that just in one like column.
Yeah, it's exactly what it's going to be in that respect. And I think that now that you sort of have an idea of what catastrophism is, that these sharp, sudden, violent events shape evolution or shape how a being comes about, you can kind of understand where we're going to get into, because we're going to reference characters that are both real and not real, such as Immanuel Velikovsky, who was sort of the ironically, he's a Russian-American psychoanalyst, but also at the same time, he's known often for just being a what people will call a pseudoscientific issue, or he's the textbook example of demarcation. He wrote famously Worlds in Collision, that, we had seen the planet Venus was ejected from Jupiter from some comet-like object that passed near Earth, changing our orbit and gravity and making us who we are. While he's referencing, of course, ancient Greek, Egyptian, and Israeli calendars to point out these catastrophic events. And in doing so, you also get a lovely reference to the wonderful, wonderful, but not real character, Charles Daniel Barker.
Yeah, and also I just want to call out Minoan is summarizing this as, so, Theosophy, of course referring to Julius Evola's famous book on Theosophy.
Of course. With its great annotated edition written by Logo Daedalus.
Logo Daedalus, yes, of course. Shout out.
We love you, Logo. Thanks so much.
I think some people are getting ahead of us too, because there's a lot of CCRU heads in the chat already bringing up hyperstition. I don't even think we'd get time to talk about that this time, because that's a pretty big idea. But we're probably going to give a shotgun blast of a lot of these definitions at the outset as well.
we definitely are in that respect. But of course, the form of neo-catastrophism as we see it today, whether it gets called as Velikovskyism or just neo-catastrophism, which, regardless of which, I think it's sort of important to look at, because these sort of schools of thought still kind of have to clash, because the debate over, well, what kills the dinosaurs in the modern academic world, it had a huge fight over, well, are the uniformitarians correct? Were there second order events that could have also led to catastrophic events as second order consequences to an asteroid striking the Earth 66 million years ago? Or were there other forms of mass extinctions that took place afterwards? Because there are records and literature that states, well, actually, you had some species of dinosaur that actually were close to the impact, specifically within the southwestern parts of the United States, that had lived on for about a million years, or even or even just a couple of million years, which is
and they call them neocons. I'm terribly sorry for these interruptions. Go ahead.
But I mean, the reason why is just because this allows you to, but it also points out, oh, well, actually, no, there are these massive destructive events that are catastrophic and will shape evolution and shape the biosphere and shape our history. And for mankind, because we are aware of the passage of time, and it is linear, and it is like an arrow flying through the air, this is going to shape our understanding of how we perceive the world around us, but also our own lifespan. And in doing so, we are now going to be dramatically affected by events that have shaped human history, because we can perceive it, we can perceive history, but also because we have our technology, and there's this great reference on page 33 that I'm going to go to. I'm going to read this quote out to you guys. I'm going to share this tab instead. So, indeed, having been cranially outsourced by the 17th century invention of calculus and fully automated with the explosion in computation following the Second World War, simulation, as at last fully externalized from the central nervous system via prosthetic delegation, now comes to progressively reverse engineer the very structure of possibility itself. For a science that incrementally relies on simulation in the form of forecast is a science that is at least in part creates its own objects. This in turn engenders the tendency for us to live more and more in a world entirely of our own making. The distinction between natural and artificial progressively collapses as we see today in fields ranging from synthetic biology to genome editing, from climate engineering to nanotech to materials research. Now unfurling on a global scale, prediction computes contingencies and provokes real-world preventative procedures. Yet the exponential thickening of predictive infrastructures breeds ever more and ever more novel contingencies to predict. So sort of just to lay this out here, you and I can think of hypotheticals. Certain people can't handle the hypothetical question really well, the infamous breakfast question. But in this case, because now we spend so much of our time with models, We have treaties that prevent nuclear testing, although I'm sure we still do it. A lot of it has been relegated now towards computer simulation. We can AutoCAD something out to see if it's, sustainable, or our models based on the data we have, or even with artificial intelligence. All of this now sort of engenders where there is no real natural or artificial or secular or religious. Like, these sort of dualistic divides kind of bleed into all one big mesh. And in doing so, our ability to now think about time, especially on scales that previous humans could never think about, to some extent they could. I mean, you see this in the Psalms, right? 1,000 years, O Lord, as yesterday as a watch in the night. But even now, we can think about millions of years from now, or hundreds of thousands of years, these longer records, which I think leads to some existential dread for some people, like we're all heckin' stardust or whatever. But
Yeah.
again, because we can perceive this way, it raises some interesting questions about, well, why do we perceive things this long, or what are we doing because we can?
Yeah, and for people who, returning to that previous paragraph, for people who can understand that, because one problem that I encountered when we covered this book on our show, Blood Satellite, was that it's a very difficult book to read aloud. You can get through it if you're reading it to yourself, but it doesn't lend itself to just reading it to other people. But if you are reading that, you can probably grasp playing around with terms like hyperreality. So that's the idea, and I think that's foundational to this, because I think a lot of this grows from the idea of hyperreality. For people who don't know that, I believe it was Baudrillard. Was it Baudrillard who did that? Simulacrum and simulation. But it's this idea of, I always reference that line from Fight Club, a copy of a copy of a copy, or the Nine Inch Nails song. A real world example. It's the fake thing that is worshipped. It's a commoditization of something real, and we forget what the real thing was. So here's an interesting example of what that would be. You have an artist, a musician, right? That musician signs a record contract and becomes a superstar. They almost become a commodity. They become something unreal, something other than human, but it's still somewhat human. Then that dies, and you go to a concert put on by the hologram of that person, and you're screaming and cheering for that hologram. That's a hyper real thing. Or nostalgia could be hyper real. Are you in love with an era or the propaganda of that era? And every step along that line, you distance yourself from the real thing. And what he's talking about in that paragraph is interesting, because a lot of these post-left guys, they're obsessed with the synthetic replicating the synthetic. And that's what Marx was obsessed with too, with going back to Capital, the entire idea of the surplus granted to us by automation becomes this like free floating entity in itself that seeks to justify its own existence. So like the surplus just exists to have more, and that's what capital is in their mind. Capital is just, it's not money for anything. It just exists to replicate itself again and again and again, but it's not real. That's in their model. So what he's really getting at there too, and this is where it starts to get trippy, it's that we have these predictive models, and then we can have models that generate other predictive models that predict the future. And it's going to get so inward facing that a lot of this stuff ends with like a fractal collapse, that we get so distant from reality and so lost within our own predictive models. We can't tell whether or not that predictive model is even accurate, or if that predictive model is interfacing back on us and causing us to create it. And that's kind of the idea of the hyperstition. It's this strange interchange of, we can no longer tell what is a predictive model or just straight up fiction, and a fiction that is realizing itself in the real world. And we get to that point only in a extremely self-replicating synthetic existence.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, because the first section, I'm saying like the first 50 pages is a big emphasis on Kantian philosophy, but also the predication of how we have been evolved with a vertebrae, not only to have bilateral symmetry, we have hands that are, these not real mirror images of each other, but they are perfectly for opposites. And at the same time, we have developed ourselves from not a radial, split, but this, but along our spine. And in doing so, we also have the ability to perceive things that are before us, not just depth, not just distance, but the way that we interact with that. And in doing so, time. And that's a big emphasis on what we're going to talk about. And I have this little quote up here, and you also took some notes on this as well for page 40. We chordates, people with spines, our immanence's self-lacerating attempt to escape itself, or what amounts to the same thing. A spine is the axial marker of nature's first attempts at dissimulation through simulation. Hence, it is a ledger of traumatisms. As Kant anticipated, it all begins with orientation, and gaining a head was one of the earlier forms of orienting itself. In dispensing with morphological radiality, the promotion of a solely sagittal plane of symmetry generates an orientational front and behind for segmenting organism, whilst optimizing the localization of a sensory array into an anterior head. Sense receptors and transducers bubble up, flowing backwards around the buccal orifice, primitive eye spots, sensory lobes, facilitating a dorsal posterior ballooning into an entire simulative universe, and ganglia pile into a cephalizing brain case. Basically, we've evolved now to understand time, but also to escape the fact that immanence is all around us. And so now we have a way to understand that immanence, to understand the trauma of existence, or to perceive time. And so essentially, our evolutionary record, our spine, from its lowest forms, and you'll notice this when you read the book itself, it's got these 3 sections: thoracic retrospect, lumbar genesis, sacral inception, and it concludes with a coccygeal postscriptum. So you're referencing all the parts of the spine, and it ends, of course, with our tailbone, our ass, our coccyx. And essentially, we're
Speak for yourself.
Speak for yourself. I know, right? And you're going through, but you're going through history in this way, and all these understandings and all these previous thinkers and philosophers and naturalists to understand why we perceive things the way that we are and what does that mean. So to really just sort of break this down even further, your spine is essentially a geological and archaeological record of biological trauma trying to escape the trauma of life itself, but also the trauma of trying to perceive and understand that.
I also want to point out, before I just build on that for a second, you hear something like that, amazing work, amazing thoughts. You glance over at the chat, and it's just people talking about people without spines, keep moving. This is a spine downtown. No one mentioned that. A bunch of chuckleheads over here in the chat. But I think that's a natural response to a lot of this. And also, just to build upon what you were just saying, you have to understand that the basis for a lot of what he's talking about here, in case we haven't mentioned it, is the importance of the fact that the spine is vertical. The spine being vertical, on one hand, he'll say, is like makes us like an antenna to heaven in a lot of ways, but it's also us trying to escape the earth in some way, trying to reorient ourselves. And like you were quoting Kant there, saying that by us being vertical, and this is just straight up biology right now. This is just medicine that we have with our eyes in front of our. Yeah, with our eyes in the front of our head, we have this concept of forwards and behind us, which grants us a linear perspective on the world that maybe a lot of animals don't have. And the fact that we're literally with our posture rebelling against the earth, that puts us as separate from animals, but also physically gives us such a thing as a time horizon, because we can see above things. So he's saying what you're seeing here is a complete marriage between like the spiritual but also the physical, that the reason we can think ahead and conceive of God is because we stand upright. And some of that it's inarguable. That's a lot of that's just evolutionary biology. But then you take that and build it up into this new sort of religion almost. But so a lot of this is based off of, like, when we talk about spinal catastrophism, it's not a metaphor. We're literally talking about the spine being a ledger of traumas and us trying to almost get away from the trauma of the earth.
Yeah, well, I mean, the tree surgeon's bit is here. Yeah, it's lift up your skinny spines like an antenna to heaven. I mean, that's definitely something that kind of gets referenced in here in the spiritual sense, but also just in the understanding of the earth and our own existence. Thielen Deschardins is referenced in here, and if you know anything about his work on like Christogenesis, or like this omega point that we're going to reach in human evolution and like the world's evolution, that we've been seeing how to exist through the incarnate logos, and now soon we are going to evolve and be like that as the species becomes more and more technologically advanced, and also as evolution continues. But again, like that overlaps then here with, you know, the Barker or the Plutonics journal and the idea of geotrauma, which I think we should probably get into before we go any further.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, because also just to set that up, when I was reading the CCRU collected writings, which you can find out there, it's an interesting book. Kind of like Fang Noumena. We also covered that on the show. So my history here was reading Fang Noumena, the CCRU writings.
And here, I'll put the links in there. Here's the CCRU stuff.
Yeah, and I just remember one line from that book, and it was geotrauma is like, what does the Earth think it is? That was the line, and I said, what did they mean by this? And it was never developed. It was probably sandwiched somewhere between Afro-Atlanteanism and the idea they were discussing where Atlantis is actually black people because Atlantis was seeded by the slaves who leapt from the slave boats. And then I guess they survived and became mermaids and became magic Atlanteans. This is just the shit they talk about. But then, there you go into geotrauma, and it's left me wondering. And then I find this book that's all about that. So just to set up my relationship with this idea.
Yeah, no, and I again, all this stuff, like I mentioned at the beginning, like, you know, you have Ian Hamilton Grant, who was writing with the CCRU in the mid 90s, but at the same time, also you see references to Nick Land, and you see references to Barker, and all these other, the Russian cosmists are mentioned here as well, the esoteric futurists, all sort of building off the idea of, well, the perception of time allows us to now, if we can perceive forward, this can be reverse engineered to look backwards. And if we look at also the history of our naturalist philosophies and sciences, there's now this record that we can reconstruct that tells us what has mankind gone through as a species, as an entity, as a creation of a deity, that can tell us how the hell did we get here. And why are we here? Are we trying to escape something? And Moynihan posits through these writers and through Kant and through especially Deleuze and Guattari that, yeah, actually we are. We are trying to escape the trauma of understanding and perceiving existence, but not just existence, but also the traumatic events that allow us to act preventatively, to do things. You know, we see these sort of innate reactions, and he doesn't reference it in the text, but for instance, there's a when you have like a newborn child and you try and put its feet down on the grass, it instinctively retracts its legs up, in part because it's foreign, but also because it's ground, it's earth, it's not something that maybe it should be on. And that, you know, evolutionary psychology plays a huge role in this fact. And in fact, evolutionary psychology plays a big part in this text, sort of answer post facto some of these ideas that these earlier naturalists were trying to explain about human evolution, but also how animals act a certain way, our instincts that we kind of ignore because we live in society in a lot of respects, but like they're still there. And we're trying to explain why we are. For instance, because we have developed the way that we have on this earth, meaning the sun hits us with its rays and it has a cycle because of our orbit. Well, what evolves out of that is our circadian rhythm. And even though you can be in a cave, your circadian rhythm is still going to give you a relatively decent 24, 25-hour cycle on how you sleep and how you interact with the day.
Yeah, and when you get into stuff like that, some people will wonder, can these ideas be reconciled with concepts of the soul or with more ancient religious ideas? I think it can. I think there's a way to view a lot of this just in a physical sense without getting... Yeah, I mean, eventually you get into really, really weird stuff. But like I said, at the beginning of this book, it gives you a lot of just, hey, here's how planets work. Here's how spine works. Our spines are kind of inhuman in the sense that they're not designed to be doing what they're doing. In a sense, you shouldn't be getting this much back pain. It's sort of like it's operating in a way that is designed to fail, and that's an odd thing to happen. So it's referencing a lot of real life things that are inarguable, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Also, I want to point out that people have made the comment that must be mentioned here. People are referencing geotrauma, as in geo from the internet's digital archipelago. I'm not the first one who's made that connection, but we were laughing about that beforehand. You have geotrauma.
I do every Tuesday. It's true.
And also people here, Yarvin speaks of Nick Land, and I say, yes, true, but don't hold that against him.
That is true. Don't hold Yarvin telling you that he doesn't read his contemporaries or his critics or his respondents, which is interesting. He'll respond to libs talking to him, but he doesn't reference everything else.
So I guess we should launch into Geotrauma now.
We really should. Let's do that.
And it's built off of that phrase, "What does the Earth think it is?" And Geotrauma. There's a great quote in here. I'm going to see if I could find it, where the idea is you descend into the spine in the same way you would descend into the earth, and you descend into the earth into its own creation. The idea that if you were to go down into the earth, you would be going into that planet's history. You'd be physically going into its formation. So he's playing around this idea early on that digging into something is like going back in time. That's where we talk about the spine being a ledger of traumas. Like, it's literally a stacked record of how you got here. And, he has that point that we mentioned earlier that, is obvious, but it never occurred to me that when a human is conceived and born, they physically go through all the phases of evolution to become a human. You start as an embryo, you start as a sperm, obviously, but then you evolve through this form almost as different creatures before you become a human. And he actually plays around this idea that whatever the future of sick, twisted, transhuman humanity will be, you will need to be born as a regular human and then become transhuman. You can never be born transhuman. It's a process you have to go through, but it's a linear time that is like solid, that you're always like, you are a physical representation of linear time, like the planet itself is a physical representation of the trauma of its own creation that you can literally dig into and understand.
Yeah, and on that note, you're also going to run into with respects to like geotrauma, you're also going to have this intersect with sort of a collective understanding of perception. So this is where like the concept of the noosphere and the biosphere gets mentioned and respectively brought up. And on that note, you'll notice that, okay, you also have a record, a geological record. You now have a spinal record. We have a human record through our genes. And then you also have, again, if you want to reference some really fun stuff, you also have like, one of those words that you always read, but like the Akashic or the Akashic record, right? Like, you have these things that communicate with a greater sense of the human consciousness, but also at the same time, there might be ways in which we can encrypt, like, are there messages in there? Have there been things left behind for us? Especially if you're someone like the infamous, Charles Daniel Barker, and about panspermia and where we planned. And can we find ways and records in our genes? And that'd be the way to do it.
And just to emphasize this again, once again, the right, sort of the general capital R right view of trauma is something that you're impacted by and you overcome eventually, or you try to figure out. This takes the view that you literally are trauma. You would not exist without trauma. You are just a manifestation of the history of trauma up upon you, and that's all any like reality is. And he gets into this idea later, which we'll have to get into another episode about. That's the sort of connective tissue between all things. Like, there's like a life force animating the universe. He makes a claim later on, like, there's no such thing as empty space in the universe. It's all like vibrations of trauma, something like that, which then you're kind of getting into quantum mechanics too, but not really.
Well, and a lot of this too reminds me of what was kind of called like the confidence crisis, especially because now you have quantum physics and our Newtonian models of physics in the universe no longer make sense. And that starts raising some really uncomfortable questions, especially in the 1920s and 30s. And there's some really rare books that cover that exact subject. But at the same time, I think also an important thing to look at is well, what the hell do we mean by trauma?
Oh, and let me just, before we go on, you mentioned something there that for people who don't know, this is an interesting idea about, you mentioned the biosphere and the noosphere for people who don't know. So you have, the planet, Earth, then there's the biosphere, which exists on top of the Earth, and that is all the life, the carbon-based, DNA-based life forms on the Earth, which is integrated with the planet almost as one coherent organism, right? Of course, all the people and the animals. The noosphere, NOO sphere, is that would be sort of like the internet. That's all the satellites. That's all the information created by life that sits above that, almost as a sphere around the Earth. But that once is just another layer to the single coherent organism of the Earth, and it's all interplaying with itself. So when people talk about the noosphere, it is viewing the Earth as if it were just one organism.
Yes, and also the other thing to look at here, what perhaps this quote will help in making some sense. Quote: "The spine is a tautology for the long durational gestation of futurity, a symbol that expresses its object not by meditating on it, but by manifesting it. But if, in becoming sensitive to time, the organism also conquers it, as exampled all the way from a rudimentary cell's heat shock proteins up to humanity's present-day apparatus for cosmological forecasting, this feed-forward encroachment of the future behaviors into present one, and it lurched into futurity, comes at a price." Tautology, if any of you know your Samuel Taylor Coleridge, you'll know this word. But if you don't, it just means really the translucence of the external through the provisional, expressing the same subject but with a difference. Or if you really want to apply it, it is a symbolic aspect in our mythology. So every person who sits down at a bench throughout the seasons, they are part of this bench and the surrounding space, and it allows you to tell a narrative through the symbol of the bench and what it has been around through all this time. So what he's saying to us is that the spine is this method, this symbol in which we can see the perception of time and the reaction to external environmental stimuli, which are usually harmful. The spine itself tells a record because we have now walked upright. We have done painful things to do so. There's references in this book telling you how the endocrine system is working overtime to handle the shock and the trauma of every footstep because we weren't originally designed this way, or we weren't originally evolved this way. We were on all fours, or we had some sort of hybrid way of being modal, but being bipedal. And that's our only real method now of communication, or not communication, but, movement. We have to adapt and evolve to it. And now, because we've become so advanced in our brain structure that we can perceive far out into the future, 9-year-old boys and girls who go to their astronomy class will then have these existential nightmares about the heat death of the universe, or the sun going to be a red giant in like 5 billion years, allegedly, and going to kill us all, even though we're going to be long dead before then. Those kind of things play a role.
You mentioned something there that we probably should have established more at the start, or I should have. It's that the relationship of time, because we mentioned time a bit more. But
yes,
when we say that the spine is a ledger of traumatisms, he also makes it very clear that it is time manifest, and not only our relationship with time, but our understanding of time is almost a curse. And he gets into this later in the book, but an awareness of time, like humans can apprehend it, not like animals or insects, but humans can. It's almost recursive in the sense that it becomes obsessed with time increasingly, and then time begins to shrink for it. So, like, time only occurs to us as we're trying to escape the trauma, but it's almost like the idea of time is birthed within us. And that leads to a crazy idea we're going to get to. I don't even think we can get to it now because I don't want to spoil it, like the role of intelligence in the universe. But it's almost like, just to set it up, like the time is like an awareness of itself, something like that. And that's how it positions human intelligence as just, some people will say like, oh, humans are God looking at itself, one of those platitudes you hear about. But that's kind of what this is. Like, we're just agents of the universe trying to escape and understand itself in some way.
Mm-hmm. Sorry about that. I was taking some medication.
Sorry, I should have shit posted a bit longer. I'll start reading comments. Oh my God, what do we got here? This is a mess.
You're good. The other thing too, that the first 50 pages out of this 230-page book, and then the next 30 pages are about notes. The first 50 or so really outline what we're working with here, especially within Immanuel Kant's philosophical works. So, for instance, he'll tell you that bones are not just concepts, but they're actual physical constraints that give us an understanding of how the body works, but also our own understanding of time in a systematic fashion. How we grow, how we develop, how we use them, and how we stop using them as we age and we get older. And at the same time, referencing a lot of Kant's work alongside some of the other individuals that we'll talk about here. We'll start looking at what does that mean in respects to time and intelligence. But I will say this though, and I'll quote this earlier chapter. Historically speaking, I contain my outside. This is what time does to a body, as we shall see in tracing out this secret history. The lesson is clear. The psychosomatic containment of oneself, when percolated through the grandest history, equals a hypogene alienation, the alienation of a body riddled with time. This is the realization that is the inaugural phylogenic fantasy that is spinal catastrophism. Hegel was perhaps wrong after all to dispute that the spirit is a bone. And now we'll turn to where all these terms and all these avenues of modern thought come from.
Can I just read one also,
yes,
a quote that kind of summarizes what page 46.
46, yeah. I'll share it
on screen. I'll just read here. It says, it's a short one. Let us then embark upon a geotraumatic vivisection of our grounds of orientation, peeling back the transcendental overlay down the osseous underlay, quarrying the prehistory of our inferential exoskeleton through our physical endoskeleton, shaving away conceptual, linguistic, and synaptic laminae, spelunking the larynx, opening the grand columns, dropping down the spinal echelons into a phylectic catabasis through our architecture of chronotopic encasement. There is no sense of time's movement without a concomitant desire to speed it up. To be aware of time moving is to anticipate the oncoming future, which invariably causes it to arrive earlier and earlier. A sense of the new, by changing the present behavior, causes the new. And this is where we start playing around with the idea of hyperstition as well. But I think that was one of the, he'll go give you these paragraphs that kind of get you lost, and he'll hit you with something like that. I'm like, okay, I get it now.
Well, I guess and again, what are we, we're building up to something, and that is we are a species that are innately developed, and we have been developed to perceive time. This causes a great deal of problems. Time itself, aging, creation, violent events, and interactions with our evolution. We not only have sort of a quasi-geological record that we can tap into, spinal tap, but also at the same time, we are recognizing that we are self-aware of these sort of traumatic events and injuries. We are aware that somehow we are going to die, whether we know it or not. We have that innate effect into us, and it has evolved and it's reflected through religion, through belief, through our society and societal organizations. Whether we do it because we wish to bury them as far away as to not get sick, or we do it because we wish that there's a way that they finally escaped. We lay them down to rest, although there were a few cultures that would bury them upright and still do. That sensitization to time, we only become more entangled with it. So we become more historically focused. We look far and far more towards the future. What is a great example of this? It would be Nick Bostrom and the world vulnerability hypothesis, where you can think of a million different ways in which the world can go wrong, and you become paralyzed, in which I am so affected by how sensitive we are, that how quickly we can be dissolved or erased. And I think that really does play into his second book, which I haven't read. But all of a sudden, like, you also get references to Reinhard Kolasek, right?
Yeah.
It's all right there.
And also what he's saying, like, just on the topic of time as well, just to relate it back to Nick Land, this is why when you speak of accelerationism and when you read it, it's not really an ideology. It's not even a political position. It's framed as more of an inevitability, right? And that's kind of what they're talking about here. There's an accelerationist tilt to this, which is like the inevitability of our awareness of time eventually collapsing in upon itself. Like, the acceleration is happening no matter what. You're aware of time, and then you increasingly become obsessed with time, like you were saying, until you kind of enter, like what we say, the 21st century, where time begins to break down in a sense, and we cannot tell the difference between synthetic futures and the real futures, and we're obsessed with interpreting the past. That we don't understand our relationship with the truth at all anymore, and that's how you know that you're deep within it. We don't even know how to chart a course back to where we came from. We're obsessed with it. We're nostalgic for it, kind of, but we don't even really know how to get back there. And I think the more we understand it, the more we're convinced that we never, it's a country we can no longer inhabit. So, that's why you start to understand the CCRU people when, like, you're just along the ride with us now. There's nothing you can do about this, so you might as well go with it.
Yeah, and I think that this also sort of allows us to set up the discussion of what is our intelligence? What does that mean? Why are we self-aware, or why have we become that way? And I think that would probably be a good tee up then, because, all right, we're fundamentally aware of time. We're fundamentally aware of the fact that our body will age, decay, but we also can perceive time, and we can also perceive the world around us in ways other animals can't. And in doing so, we get into a particularly interesting worldview where we can now look at time in a much longer format. And unfortunately, this leads us to talk about Barker and our wonderful world of catastrophism and intelligence and cosmic time. But where do you want to go with it then?
Well, let's set up this character of, like, what is...
Yeah, let's do Barker. That's probably the best idea.
Yeah, we've mentioned him a couple of times, and when I was first reading Fang Denumina, that's where I really started with Nick Landy, because Meltdown, the essay, is in there near the end, but there's a whole brick of stuff before that. But he mentions this figure named Barker, who was...
Daniel Charles Barker.
Yeah, who's purported to be a professor at Miskatonic Online University, Miskatonic Virtual University, MVU. And then you're reading that and you're like, oh, that's interesting. Eventually you start to, and you read his life story, you read about his work, and his work sounds fantastical. Then eventually, if you really read into it, you realize, oh, this is a person that never existed. They just made up a guy. I'm 99% sure he's just made up. I've read it that he was. And it's cool. He's a character. And that's why if you look into the CCRU, into the lore of this, it's on a Wikipedia page, because there's all these alternate histories. There's all these characters they just invented that are referenced between different authors even still. So there's now a digital footprint of these people across time, and it just keeps expanding over time, which is an interesting phenomena as this man becomes real as the years go by. Now, that's my understanding of Barker and his work, but usually in books like this, anytime I'm seeing brought up, he's almost like an exposition dump. It's like, oh, they're going to talk about Barker's research, which is just some cool, trippy sci-fi stuff that relates directly to the philosophical idea we're trying to develop.
Yeah, and you get this kind of early on. This is your exposition. This is your lore dump. Essentially, this infamous character, Daniel Charles Barker, 1952 to present day, still alive allegedly, who coined the term in Spinal Catastrophism in 1992. And you see DC Barker, Spinal Catastrophism, and Plutonics in 1992, 13 through 42, if you want to read the references. But again, interesting, but again, no. Anyways, unfiction aside, we get the references to Immanuel Velikovsky. The neo-catastrophism was an influence. So, this is a guy who's allegedly working over at NASA and SETI, has a background in cryptography. Then you have the Barker affair and the Velikovsky affair. And essentially you get very speculative beliefs into the world. And so one of these speculations, of course, is about catastrophism. Things, of course, that geoscience and cosmology aren't necessarily on board with, because these aren't effective models, allegedly, towards our understanding of how the world came to be. Although these sort of debates really kicked off about uniformitarianism being overturned in the 80s, about the KPG boundary.
Sorry, can I interrupt you for a second?
Yeah, go for it.
Sorry, geoscience is bringing a microscope to a Chinese buffet. Sorry, continue.
Yes, there you go. Absolutely. Yeah, I met Daniel Charles Barker at the OGC conference. I met him too. Don't worry. We are all Daniel Charles Barker. It's all right. It's okay. It'll all make sense, but it won't.
That's like you got to just go with it, guys. Like you're gonna start wondering, wow, is this made up? Yes and no.
Yes and no.
You got to have fun with it.
It's like a tulpa that has been created to express ideas.
Enjoy
the
great
techniques.
Great example. Actually, this would be like a tulpa is a great way of explaining it, because there's so much occult stuff in this that would be a perfect metaphor.
Yeah. So again, you're talking about he was hired almost immediately for SETI. His cryptographic background recommended him for messaging to extraterrestrial intelligences, or search for extraterrestrial artifacts. Anyways, the major difference between the naturally occurring and intelligently originating interstellar activity, as Barker wrote, can only be the latter can decide to camouflage itself. Hence the interest in what I referenced earlier with those god-awful Halo references about, there are things implanted in our genes that say, potentially what was called directed panspermia, that life may have been deliberately seeded by alien intelligence, that we ourselves as humans are an archaeological site for, xenobiology or whatever. But
yeah,
anyway,
and also
lore dumps aside, I'll get to the actual stuff, but go on.
He mentioned something there in the search for extraterrestrial artifacts, which again is just a cool sci-fi idea, but it's also grounded in something interestingly philosophical, saying that in this hypothetical NASA laboratory, they're saying that any advanced intelligence is almost indistinguishable from its environment. That's what they say. It's completely camouflaged. So they start looking not for evidence of technology that is incongruent with the planet or whatever, but starting to say that, there's probably these things we think are just naturally occurring organisms, but are themselves advanced intelligence that have just assumed a form that looks completely indescribable. So that's where they start getting into this idea of like planets and nebula and stuff being hypothetically forms of the highest intelligence.
Yeah, and again, it sort of also overlays with the cosmists and the sort of Christogenesis view in that respect. But what we get with catastrophism, trauma is a body, or we can't take time's homogeneity for granted, because cosmic time has morphological inheritances that can create distortive effects on how we perceive time. And again, he's talking about time on a cosmic scale. We're talking millions of years. But to reference what Barker writes, for humans, there is a particular crisis of bipedal erect posture to be processed. This took me back to the calamitous consequence of the Precambrian explosion, roughly 500 million years ago. Obviously, there are discrete, quasi-coherent neuromotor Tix flux patterns whose incrementally rigidified stages are swimming, crawling, and bipedal walking. Erect posture and perpendicularization of the skull is a frozen calamity associated with a long list of pathological consequences, amongst which should be included of most of the human psychoneuroses. So, whether he's referencing things from millions of years ago to how we have back pain, or that, his alleged, discrediting from NASA is that, I'll just read this fun little bit of fiction because we have to have fun here, right? And by this point, NASA was finished with Barker. His office was filling with endocasts and craniometric charts. Colleagues later recounted that instead of conducting signals and detections analysis, he would spend his waking hours retrofitting seismological imaging algorithms for the detection of deep brain vibrations and elasticities, claiming that super chiasmatic shear waves encoded data relevant for predicting coronal mass ejections. He was unceremoniously fired, and he was recalled as messy owing to his high-level clearance, and his ideas were neatly yet fiercely ridiculed. Amid rumors of an orchestrated smear campaign, Barker quietly moved on to his position at Miskatonic Virtual University.
For people who know, this is also very close to the biography of Nick Land himself.
Yes.
It's interesting stuff. A very fascinating guy. Also, you mentioned something there, because we could spend so long just on the glossary of this thing. He talks about sort of some tick systems. This is an idea that's developed later, and it's actually, I was introduced to it again in Fanged Noumena, and I couldn't appreciate it at the time, but near the end of that book, there is an interview with Daniel Barker. I forget who's. I think it's just Nick Land interviewing Daniel Barker, but it's this sort of thing, and they're talking about how, I'm going to probably butcher it in the summary, but how would you know that you found an alien communication? The idea was that they would not communicate linearly. They would not communicate like we do in sentence form, either vertically or horizontally. That how do you tell what an intergalactic message would be? How would it stand apart from other information in the universe? And so it almost had to be like a three-dimensional message that can be read, or it's like a pattern of some kind. That's how I was looking at it. So a tick system, a TIC, I've got actually a definition from the CCRU wiki. I'll just read a bit. It says, tick is a quantum of disruption, anomaly, complexity, and rhythm. The traumatic disruption and glitchy rupture of various processes, time, memory, identity, meaning, comfort, actual boundaries, whatever. So it's like a tick is like an irregularity. You're detecting something that is purposeful, but it's wrong. And these ticks can be sort of arranged in patterns themselves, almost like a hidden code in the universe. And it says the three most important aspects of a tick are a marker of difference, beats that measure time and create rhythm, and compulsively repetitive behaviors constituting a quanta of non-personal trauma. So in this sense, trauma is kind of just something that impacts you, that is not just naturally occurring. So anyway, that's just an interesting idea. I just, maybe an aside or a bit of a tangent about, really that's what they're talking about, and we're trying to look for extraterrestrial communication. Well, what is communication? Well, it's a pattern. Well, that pattern could also be life, and that life could also be trauma. It's like, so then you start seeing what they're trying to explore, which is like, what are we looking for as evidence of life in the universe? It's almost some fucking anomalous life itself that's like letting itself be known to you through trauma. I know, again, we're getting really trippy here, but if you're not having fun, then you're gay.
And again, we're going to get references to the late English writer J.G. Ballard, where he's like, Barker says, yeah, this guy was great because he preempted the ideas of the DNA as a memory bank and the spine as a fossil record. And really, that's kind of the argument that you're going to get out of what the spine is, but also our reference to understanding time and for culture. But to talk about time just a little bit more, for J.G. Ballard, it seems the built environment externalizes our anatomical poises and desires, but such externalization in turn reprograms us from the inside out. Thus, he augurs that any society attaining suitable infographic density and media massification experiences severe chronotopic leakage. As explored, when enough of our environment is captured by and entangled with intentional and artifactual systems, the distinction between artifice and nature progressively collapses. Civilization grows ectopic unconscious, an outpouring of drive mechanism, erotic catharses, extracranially exported like a mutant spider in the short story The Voices of Time, whose artificially expedited evolution enables it to externally ramify its central nervous system by weaving extrasomatic ganglion networks instead of a web, fabricating an averted second brain. I'm going to try my best to break that down for you real quick. Because actually, to break this down is essentially what he is saying is we create an ectopic unconscious. Basically, we have an externalized system of perceiving the world outside of what our limited brains can do. If you know your McLuhan, what is he referencing here? He's referencing auto amputation and he's referencing over socialization. So we now have the ability to perceive so much information that time moves faster than what we can actually perceive. So if you're constantly online, like myself, you are going to laugh at the fact that like hick-lib moron, whose name I can't even remember, who had that one song about, working all day or something.
Oh, Oliver Anthony.
Oliver Anthony. That was what, at the beginning of this year?
Seems like a lifetime ago.
It seems like a lifetime ago. No, it was August 8th, 2023. So a little over a year ago, the Richmond north of Richmond. A little over a year ago. But in my brain and how I can perceive these things, that was 5 million years ago. Gamergate, 20 millennia ago. Freaking Carl Benjamin being called a garbage human being by Anita Sarkeesian, that feels like ancient history.
He's lived like 5 lives between then and now.
I know, five lifetimes from then and now. But because of that, we have the technology and our ability to communicate that has allowed us to mimic our own biological prefixes. There's a lot of mimesis here. We are constantly using our bodies and our neural networks and pathways as things to copy with artificial forms of like technology, large language learning models, are all of our tools are built around to mimic the way that we use things with our own bodies. But because this leakage takes place, we naturally can have intense traumas because we are now overloading not only our own neural network, our brains, but also our neuro networks, our technologies, to where, well, if there's new information that comes and hits us that affects our ability to perceive the world or time, what do we say? Nothing ever happens. That is a McLuhan form of auto amputation. I am not going to be subject to new entry points of the future or entry points of possibilities of the future. So I say, fuck it. Nothing ever happens.
Have you ever said that before, or is this just like the first time you've debuted that take? Because I like that one.
This is the first time I've debuted it. I've talked about it privately, but I mean, it is a form of auto amputation.
I wish this wasn't live, so I could. If this wasn't live, I would take that.
I know, and that's
it's very good. I don't know if people appreciate how good that is, but I think you do. Some do. Probably the guys who pay you money understand how smart that was. But just also to dive into that idea. I just want to return to what I was saying before. You were talking about the sort of synthesis between like time and us with nature and stuff, and what we were talking about, advanced life being sort of camouflage in the universe itself. You know, he gets into some projections of what humanity will look like in the future, but there's this idea of like, imagine we keep on creating these recursive worlds of information and technology. Eventually they begin to merge with nature itself, and we have these vast forests of technology that eventually begin to mimic nature itself, and it's this constant interplay between the two. And then we begin to inhabit those, and eventually we just build them out of pure energy, and then we literally are a nebula. That's kind of what he's talking about right now. Like, if we keep advancing along this path, we just integrate further and further until we are some energy-based information. We basically become Hyperborean at that point.
Is there anything that you want to add just on the perception of time?
No, except just to circle back to, if people are unaware of the whole McLuhan thing, this is an interesting phenomena that he points to in, I think it was Understanding Media, that as technology progresses, our understanding of time gets shorter and shorter. And, you know, the source of this is, you know, consider your own life. Not only do events of the past seem further and further apart, but we start to measure time. You know, McLuhan plays around this idea of, after the Industrial Revolution, time became a container of value, and previously it wasn't. So like in 15 minutes is a container of labor of value. So you can waste time. The entire idea of wasting time did not exist in previous history. But then we start to measure future time in increments, and you think a lot about what the next quarter is going to be. And so not only does the immediate past seem more distant, the future is getting closer and closer and closer until you're almost perpetually inhabiting the next day presently. So if you think about the way the average person, these viewers, live their lives, it is a pretty inhuman way of doing it. So, you know, you're already along that path.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of an important thing to consider is that, you know, we joke about leftists, for example, like on the Twitter timeline. Do you know who Solion is on Twitter, Dimes?
Actually, yes, it's kind of spelled weird, isn't it?
Yeah,
like,
it is.
Yeah. I know that guy.
Yeah, he's got that great. It's a Twitter litmus test essentially, where anytime some like irony leftist like quotes at him or snips at him when he's making an inflammatory remark, he just looks up the word depression. And it's always there on their timeline, some sort of depression or mental illness. And he's just like, and it's almost like every single time. It's impressive at how good this like litmus test is. But on that point, it is great because, these people are sad. And people that on our side of things, they don't seem so sad. They don't seem so depressed. If not, they're really good at hiding it. But at the same time, why are we so, like, why is that the case? People are inundated with information, the future. You know, when people in Britain are polled, and it's not Britain, it was the United States, I've talked about this elsewhere, when 13% of Americans say that they are not having children because of climate change, because of some perceived future, not only have they opted to self-select for a suicidal ideation in the name of saving the future, so this kind of like Kiliastic utopianism through self-sacrifice, this terrible perversion of Christianity, has essentially created the last form of genocide, which has been voluntary extinction of an entire race. And in doing so, like, because of our perceptions of time, we have now watched a voluntary form of traumatic events and influences leading to the self-selection and filtration of an entire group. Right? Like, that's an insane form of trauma on a cosmic and genomic scale that eventually, I imagine, will be reflected in future spinal history.
Yeah, and you use this great term early on, and it's one that I use all the time, is genetic bottleneck or an evolutionary bottleneck. And we are a record of these evolutionary bottlenecks. It's where the mass population collapses and you have a new founding stock that once again repopulates from there. And that is essentially what life itself is. You get old, you have children, then you die. There's always an existential bottleneck in the family in that sense. But yeah, that is the nature of life. And there is truth to there's truth behind this, where it's like our entire existence seems to be a record of traumas, or at least it feels that way. And you mentioned something very fascinating there. And this is a phenomenon in the West that goes back centuries, but it became more profound in the 60s, where how much of our existence is foretelling an immediate collapse or an immediate apocalypse, even if it's a joyous apocalypse like the age of Aquarius. It seems that most people, and this is like the climate change example you had, it doesn't even need to be climate change, because climate change is largely just fucking bullshit. It's made up, but it doesn't matter if there's data. It doesn't matter if the data is incorrect, but there's just this persistent feeling that the world's gonna end soon, and they're just swapping in a reason. But it's become more and more profound over the past few decades. But you can kind of chase this problem back centuries if you want to. But just to add to your point, I believe that to be accurate.
Yeah, and here you have the CNS is the time machine, the central nervous system. I gotta do all the rotations so you can see it makes sense. The atlas, the axis, and then all the way here down to the sacrum. Mineral, Adian anguish, spinal landscape revealed at lumbar transfer. Compass of Tagmata, thoracic drop into phylogenetic time. So you're beginning to see what we see here, like a fossil record. Thoracic, cervical, and then entry to the future. The perception of the future comes at our form of intelligence and higher understanding of time on scales that we are not used to understanding.
Yeah, and again, for people who are wondering if the spine was still being used as a metaphor, no, it is time travel.
Yes, literally, no. I mean, that's the word that gets used, is time travel. You're going to get a lot of that in here.
Yeah, and people are like, what do you mean you can travel the time? No, you are time travel. Like, the more you dig into it, the more it's just a house of mirrors. Yeah,
essentially, it's what that's going to be.
And that's where he kind of gets to later on, and I might be jumping ahead, but when we talk about, I think there's been some comments in here about, I am my spine. Like, no, you don't get, you are. His version of humans in the future is just a head and a spine. The rest of your appendages can go, but the spine is, in this model, probably more important than your brain. In fact, they would say that the brain just is an appendage of the spine.
Essentially, yes. That's definitely what we would get here, though. But I mean, so we kind of talk about trauma. We talk about this record. So what on God's green earth does that really mean? And I think that this might be the last thing we touch on before we really get into it, because there are two big things we have to talk about. So this is in TH3, the law of superposition and biogenetic law. And I'll put it up on screen so we can read along. And this is page 71 if you have the PDF with you, which I shared on Telegram, and I would highly recommend it, that you give this a read yourself. Spinal catastrophism is constructible as the conmixture of two venerable idea clusters. First, the notion of depth as memory and the law of superposition, traceable to the 17th century genesis of geosciences, and second, embryology's theory of recapitulation, also known as biogenetic law, which itself is traceable to the late 18th century collision of absolute idealism with natural history. The convergence of these two notions, the law of superposition and biogenetic law, furnished the matrix within which spinal catastrophist notions first become articulated via self-obsolescing exacerbation of internal logic of two core Enlightenment idealist tenets. The principle of continuity was abrogated by superposition, and recapitulation arose as a mutation of the principle of identity, which this chapter will get into. But I mean, those are the two things that we're going to have to talk about here for sure.
Yeah, depth as memory is kind of what we were covering there before with the whole geotrauma thing.
Yeah, that's for sure. What else do you want to? Well, I guess we should just start there then. Really, I mean, the depth as memory is sort of what we've talked about really already, like you said. So I guess biogenetic law would be the best one. But I think we can just read through this short little bit, and this will probably do a lot of explanation, and we can cover up where things don't make sense.
Yeah.
An anciently held presumption, the principle of continuity, was first given explicit and precise formulation by Leibniz, inspired by his successes with infinitesimals and differential calculus. Leibniz proclaimed that between any two natural instances, there is necessarily an infinity of intermediary instances. No interstice, no saltation, no genuine and irreducible abruption, a genuine indivisibility as a separation that just is, without further explanation, would introduce unaccountability into the ligature of rationally structured nature, something that was firmly foreclosed by Leibniz's cognate principle of sufficient reason, thus to be concentrically included and concentrically included in turn ad infinitum. There's a lot there to read out loud. And it's, like you said earlier, it's not fun to read this out loud. I've read through this pretty fast earlier today and throughout the last couple of months, and now I'm reading it out. And I did a lot of this actually because I don't really read anything quietly, in part because I live alone and I can just read out loud. And I think that it's better that people should read out loud anyways, because it helps reinforce what you're reading and what you're doing. This is why scripture is a liturgical text. It's not something that you should read quietly.
Yeah, this is what I ran into on our show, where like I would start reading this to my co-host Judas, like something like that. I'd be like, no, I can't. This doesn't make sense. Like I need to really pause, because he's got a part here at the end there. I like where Leibniz therefore announced not only is there life everywhere, but there's also infinite degrees to it. Or conversely, there's nothing fallow, nothing sterile, nothing dead in the universe. Each single life is contained within infinitely many other lives and includes infinitely many others in turn without remainder, because, and then it goes on like that. But that's kind of what we were getting at. We seeded these ideas early on in the discussion about how you view life in the universe, that the universe isn't dead. It's actually teeming with life. It's teeming with the conflict of life, kind of meaning the trauma.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, that's going to be the big thing that we're going to have to deal with here. But essentially, the principle of continuity, and then, of course, principles of identity. I'm going to scroll. Well, actually, I'll just go through the whole thing and see if there's some part here that I think is important to consider. But yeah, spurred on by Leeuwenhoek's innovations of microscopy, Leibniz therefore announced not only is there life everywhere, but there's also infinite degrees of it, or conversely, there's nothing fallow, nothing sterile, nothing dead in this universe, which, for Earth, that's definitely the case. I mean, even we as humans are so, when we talk, for those who like to talk about, we need to settle Mars, it's actually going to be a problem unless we're willing to bring in very carefully controlled environments the very tiny life forms that actually we've evolved to live with and that we have been created to coexist with, whether that be parasites or tiny microscopic life that, or beings that exist in your gut fauna or in your eyes, things like that you're going to have to deal with. And if you aren't going to be able to deal with it, then we're going to have severe problems trying to colonize sterile dead worlds.
If I can just quote Johnson here from the chat, he's flexing on us. He says, outsideness is God, and that interface is where time travel comes from, which is not time travel, but the eternal. This actually isn't that hard. Well, excuse me. But I actually have a quote from page 78.
I wonder
which
if that's
actually,
where he got his original Twitter handle.
yeah, well, because once you start reading this, you start understanding what outsideness is, or kind of like stepping outside of things. I wanted to skip ahead to just page 78.
Yeah, go for it.
Which is in this ballpark. He says, provoked by the unstable compromise between absolute idealism and natural history, this obsession with developmental repetitiousness became a core tenet of Gottzied natural philosophy. It promulgated the conviction among many practicing naturalists that the entire external universe was simply a fossilized museum of various arrested stages of evolutionary development, relics or abortion from the mind's unconscious voyage unto self-consciousness. So that what appears from within a chronotopic constraint as a unified present moment or window into simultaneity is revealed instead as an exploded view cross-section of radically disarticulated moments in total time, each internal organ or external species a piece of suspended historical shrapnel. And, you know, when I read this stuff, I was overcome with this phrase when I had to describe it to people. It's like time, a different spatialization of time. And I'm sure the CCRU guys would balk at that. But, you know, I'm always obsessed with linear time versus cyclical time. That's a sort of perennial discussion in our groups of sort of the ancient tribal cyclical time versus, according to E. Michael Jones and many other, philosophers and, theologians, the linear time birthed by logos, right? But then there's this sort of, it's not just a straight line. It's not beginning, middle, and end. There's like an explosion of time, like a cross section of multiple dimensions. That's how we understand time, which means you have to conceptualize time not as a linear sequence, but like an ecosystem, which is a strange way of imagining time. But if you try and think eternally, if you try to imagine the universe as God might imagine the universe, you would imagine that's how God would view the universe, just as one space, and we only move through it just because of our mortal constraints. But and that's why I said this whole outlook is a distinctly 21st century creation, because you could not explain something like this to a 15th century mind or any time prior. Like, their minds could not apprehend any of these ideas. But once you're talking about like time as these exploded intersections of dimensions, which actually goes hand in glove with a lot of quantum mechanics stuff, there's this idea. This is getting really trippy, but there's this idea, which a lot of people don't really give a lot of credit to quantum gravity, but I read a book on quantum gravity. It's kind of interesting. I'm trying to figure out, like, what is the particle of gravity? What is gravity? What controls it? How can we identify it? We know it's a phenomena, but once you go down to the quantum level, it's just particles. So is there a particle for gravity? And it gets into this, once you get down to the smallest level of, quarks and Planck lengths and things like that, you start to into the spins of the quarks. Like, that's what governs all the matter and energy in the universe. It's just certain spins on quarks. But then, like, okay, but what is the universe? What is space, right? And even then, in the world of quantum mechanics, they're playing around with this idea of spin foam, which I'm going to butcher this in my recounting of it, but it's like it's the physical they start to describe the universe itself as just one big ethereal computer, and we are inhabiting the memory of the universe. Like, the physical universe is just a snapshot of a memory, like a computer recording onto a hard drive, right? Now, a spiritual person could say, well, how is that different than inhabiting the mind of God? And there actually is no practical difference. It's just whatever words you want to use. So I just found it fascinating that you could pursue the into the depths of science, and you start talking about like eternal minds and inhabiting the universe's memory of itself. And you're like, that's a weird way to view existence, but that's what a lot of quantum physicists are looking at right now. Anyway, but like I was saying, it's to get this idea, you have to consider like a spatialization of time, not as a linear sequence of events, but like an intersecting dimensional thing. Anyway, that was I gave you a lot there, so I hope any of that was usable.
I hope it was more usable for chat in this respect. Listen, I am aware that a lot of this does not grok with the Weltanschauung or my own worldview. This stuff is interesting to me, especially as someone who takes his faith particularly seriously. But with respects to this stuff, pretty damn interesting to me. For instance, this part right here, and this is the thing I kind of wanted to get into.
Oh yeah, this part. This is good.
We referenced higher beings or iteration. Matter is amnesiac mind. Applied embryologically, this conviction led to the so-called Meckel-Seres law, which claimed that the development of the individual organism obeys the same laws as the development of the whole animal series. That is to say, the higher animal in its gradual development essentially passes through the permanent organic stages that lie below it.
Yeah, that's what we were saying before.
Yeah, this law was formulated in 1821. By the time of Ernst Haeckel's work in the 1860s, the principle had been raised to the status of an evolutionary axiom and obtained the maximum slogan density. Ontogeny recapitulates philogeny. Thus, biogenetic law was announced. And that, of course, that, untenable, unstable compromise. But you'll notice this, and I don't know if the image is here that has it or not, and immediately around us. But you'll notice on the cover of this book, and then in other conversations, you'll notice all of these photos of embryos of different species, and mankind, of course, is right there next to it. And it's like, look at these previous forms, and they're trying to explain things that, of course, if you're a religious person, you already have an answer for this. But if you're not, and you're trying to make sense of things philosophically, or even as a naturalist, you're left with these kind of ideas. And what Moynihan is doing is basically just exploring these concepts and applying it that intelligence is our way of escaping, or being the escape go-to of our perception of time, and being the higher being is to escape our perception of time itself.
I also want to call attention to a comment here by D. Silentio.
Yeah.
He says, the author's ignorance of harmonic cube is demonic. I do not know what that means. Do you?
Not in particularly.
D. Silentio, please tell me what you mean by harmonic cube. My instinct tells me this is something I need to know about.
Is this the time cube thing?
I just see a cube and I want to know more. I'm a simple guy.
Do we just mean like the simultaneous, harmonic stuff, like the weird time perception, like the? I only know of this because of the fucking I think Geo mentioned this to me. But I think this is what he's referring to. If chat wants to, if he wants to go on. Oh, you guys don't know about time cube? Yeah, time cube. Yeah, classic internet.
Sorry,
okay.
Sorry, I don't know what.
Pardon me. I'm barely aware of it, but I'm gonna go look that up for later discussion.
It sounds like something. There's a show called Timeline Earth. Did they talk about this?
No,
that sounds like Time Cube.
This was a website that was launched 30 years ago. That doesn't. It's not around there anymore.
I think this was sent to me by someone. And I was going to cover this on the show.
Yeah.
And I looked at it. I'm like, I don't know where to begin with this. Okay, I know what this is now.
Okay, so yeah, his theory of everything called Time Cube, which polemically claims that all modern sciences are participating in a worldwide conspiracy to teach lies by omitting his theory's alleged truth that each day actually consists of 4 days occurring simultaneously. And he, of course, Ray described himself as a godlike being with superior intelligence, which has absolute evidence and proof for his views. Ray asserted repeatedly and variously the academic world is not taking time cube seriously.
Also, there's more than 4 sides to a cube, right?
Well, yeah.
So I don't know why the time, because if it was a time cube, there'd have to be more days occurring simultaneously. So maybe it's a time square.
I'm gonna have to go on a weird fucking dive later.
Notice how you could put this diagram in Spinal Catastrophism and be like, anyway, oh yeah, that tracks.
That makes sense. That tracks.
Socrates lives here at this angle. Okay, yeah, I'm nodding. I'm in it.
Yeah.
This is jazz. This is just fucking.
If it, if it makes you feel any better, harmonics is referenced.
Here we go. Now
But
people are just saying time cube in the chat.
but it's literally only mentioned in the preface about astronomy and harmonics and somatics, just about the whole idea and perceptible or coterminous insofar as intelligibles are patterns of which perceptibles are semblances or reflections. And of course, he's building off the Platonic questions.
Yeah, and he's got this sort of playing around in the same sandbox on page 66. I had this other highlight that I wanted to get to before, in case we don't get to later. Organic development is just the future arriving early. Organic structure is just the retention of the past, and our experience of time is nothing but movement within this morphospace. This is kind of what I was talking about before, about a different spatialization and understanding of time. If new chronoreceptive organs are kineogenic, arriving from some unforeseen evolutionary future, spinal descent traces the paleogenetic retrogression into deep pasts. The implication being that if time is emitted by the central nervous system architecture, then there are other possible receptivity profiles, other workable organizations in time, organizations which, from within our current central nervous system architectonic, can only appear to us as instances of time travel, as contortions of unlinearity, precocious futures, or recidivist pasts. So just to summarize what we were talking about with a new shape of time proposed by this, that's another way to say it.
Yeah, there you go. Sorry.
Enough said.
I'm now going to have to go down this weird time cube rabbit hole, but that's for another time. That I want to focus more so on the
time cube has got us. We've been arrested by time cube.
Apparently we've been got by time cube. But no, so before we go, I'm going to probably leave it here with respects to about intelligence and brain development, because that is an important thing, I think, that we're going to have to get into, because
yes,
lumbar genesis is probably going to be a next section. So I mean, the thoracic retrospect is stuff I want to get into and try and finish as much as can. But if not, the idea that I want to really get into, because of course, like Bataille is mentioned in here, and so many others. But what I'm going to get into, of course, is the question about intelligence and escape, because I mean, we've kind of teased it out, but so a question that gets asked is, can we escape our spine, or will we expire along with it? And that's sort of like a bit, and sort of the same question about like the Earth, and you were like, well, what the hell does that mean? You know, and this is where you sort of get talked about with what are our brains, like the development of certain parts of our brain, and then, you know, with respects to trauma and being territorialized. But what I will note for this, before we go like really too far deep into it, is of course a lot of fun Freudian analysis. So you've got you know, the biological way in which we exist. So like, for instance, psychoanalysis, you know, a lot of it started with anatomy, or you know, trying to understand how our brain cells worked. And so, for instance, you know, Moynihan writes, the pre-psychoanalytical work of Freud saw him mastering neuroanatomy, mapping the phylogenetic path of ganglion cells. As his interest subsequently moved up the spinal cord, they simultaneously migrated from lampreys in fish toward man. And I'm sure some of you are familiar with the infamous lamprey Freud bit about eel dick, but I'm sure we'll leave that alone. I'll let you look up the salmonella clip there, audience. But you know, so he goes to neurobiology and then embarking upon psychoanalysis. Freud, by his own admission, remained faithful to the line of work upon which I had originally started. He merely migrated, in his own words, from the spinal cord of the lowest of the fishes up to the human central nervous system. His psychoanalytical work naturally attributed a central role to bipedalism. Upright posture expedited the central role played by sight within human sexuality, as opposed to the quadrupeds corphophiliac unwelt, tethered to the horizontal digestive axis, anchored to the olfactory stimulation. Freud speculated that our sexuality develops as we grow into a more bipedal state, and that leads to development. Not saying you should take Freud seriously. There's a lot of issues with him. If you want to go play the believer clip, by all means, you can have fun with that too. But he, for Moynihan, he builds off of Freud and his student Wilhelm Reich, about our understanding of our feelings with regards to our lovely, wonderful world of spinal catastrophism, and that bipedalism is a big part of their understanding. Freud strives to go upward. Reich wants to go into oceanic feelings, along with the idea of what Roland was working on. However, both of these guys have their books burned by both the Reich and the U.S. government.
There's an interesting idea there that's discussed with Freud in relationship to another interesting character by the name of Wilfred Bion, who we've discussed before, that group dynamics versus individual psychoanalysis. And there's an idea there with Freud that, like you said, it's not so much about the oceanic feelings, it's more about the individual as an upright, completely rational and individualistic being. Because what Freud did, and this is what psychiatry still does, it's a one-on-one interrogation. Even though you talk about other people in psychiatry, you don't really deal with people as a community. You deal with them still as an individual. So I think Freud, and again, there's a lot to say about Freud. People will often discount the weird, bad stuff, the blind alleys he went down, but also remember that without Freud, you wouldn't even have the concept of the unconscious. So if you've ever believed in there's this thing called the unconscious, well, that actually comes from Freud. There's a lot of stuff that came out of Freudian analysis that you don't even notice that you use it every single day. But I think there's something there where his understanding of psychiatry was a solitary, atomized experience, and he could only approach it from like a distinctly rational viewpoint, which might not be how most people experience the world.
Yeah, and again, that's a whole other can of worms that you're going to just have to take for granted on this text, especially because if you read anything from the post-structuralists, if you read Land, especially his early work, if you read Deleuze, if you read Baudrillard, if you read Guattari, if you read Foucault, Freud is just cited all over, and they're trying, and if also with like especially Deleuze, they're trying to apply their own views to Freud as Freud and Marx applied their viewpoints to the modernist lens that they had, as well as to like capitalism and Adam Smith. And you're kind of dealing with the synthesis and the fallout of that. So like we mentioned at the very beginning of the show, or this recording, that, we're using language that exists from people that we may not like, but it is the language that we are sort of structurally limited to using in order to deconstruct the world around us. I mean, a really good example of this would be like Paul Gottfried's After Liberalism. I don't think Paul Gottfried by any chance would call himself a liberal. I mean, maybe you could call him or classify him as a post-liberal because he's looking towards what happens after this sort of order or this time frame of this political order falls apart or moves on, what will come after it. But you have to use the language in which you exist in order to explicate a deconstruction as to how you got there and what's going to come next. And that's basically what we're seeing here, is using these sort of strange philosophical tangents and fictional characters to explore ideas that say, actually, through like depth is memory, and through looking at all these like 18th and 19th and 20th century naturalists and natural sciences, as well as psychoanalysis, that we are a creature that has a deep genetic memory and record that shows a history of mankind as a species, painful and destructive ends, trying to escape our own awareness of ourselves. If that makes any sense.
It does. And what I find with a lot of post-left thinkers and Marxist thinkers is I frequently agree with their starting points. It's only at the end points where we begin to diverge. And a lot of people will, dismiss me for saying this, but like if you've actually read Marx, if you've read Capital, like there's some good ideas in there, or at least he's trying to at least in the first volume. My favorite was the first volume, not the Engels stuff later on, but the entire idea of identifying this phenomena of the surplus as manifested through automation. Like he was looking at something new that was happening and saying, here's how it's changing our relationship with labor. That part's real. And it doesn't benefit us to ignore that. Now, I might disagree with the prescriptions on how to address that, but I find with a lot of these writers, they pick starting points that no one on our side is interested in. Like really delving into the idea of trauma. There's not a lot of people on our side that would be willing to like hang their hat on that. But I think there's very useful stuff in there, and you don't want to become a reactionary about it and just say, oh, because the wrong people are talking about it, that means it's not important. Well, then you just end up backing yourself into a darker and darker corner and not interfacing with information that might help explain your historical period more fully.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that wholeheartedly. And again, I think one of the big reasons why this text really just struck out to me was just that, oh, this is offering just an alternative, like, look at the world. And also that, to me, as someone who looks at my own beliefs and my own worldview, that I can trace random violent events that have shaped my understanding of the world, but also those traumatic events I'm also trying to decontextual or deconstruct. I've jokingly said throughout the 4 years I've been doing this that a lot of my political life growing up as a teenager and an adult has been trying to deconstruct and break away from like the post 9/11 consensus. Because I grew up as a military brat. My dad was in the Pentagon when 9/11 happened.
I was going to say, my dad did 9/11.
Yeah, well, I mean, somebody did, but it wasn't my father. I think there's somewhere in Tel Aviv or in Riyadh. But anyways, it's just like, oh, and so my worldview had a very like patriotic, like GWAT kind of upbringing, and then all of a sudden, like, I grew up with Barack Obama, and then and when I was an adult, Trump came into the world in that respect. But it was like, oh, like Barack Obama is just as bad, and if not absolutely worse, in so many ways that I think he's one of the most consequentialist presidents in the United States history, at least in like modern times. But and so again, I look at our ideologies online, like all these little cliques and these tribal formations that perceive history different. We have our own revisionist take on these things. And why do we do that? Well, in part because we have these like random traumatic events that have like radically shifted things, like World War II, in terms of like a grand scheme of history of thousands of years. Short war, millions dead, radically has reoriented and realtered the genetic like lineage of all of Europe and America and other parts of the world, and at the same time has also like radically changed the way in which we perceive the state and politics and certain cultures. And it's like, okay, well, that means that there's a history in which we can trace ideology. And some of these CCRU guys and some of these schizoanalysts have talked about that, the history of a concept, the history of an ideology. And there are catastrophic events that shape it. Like why we don't trust people because random catastrophic events where it's like, but they're not random or catastrophic. There's top down deliberation, and you see that with say like trying to arrest Douglas Mackey, or now more recently the EPA and other parts of the federal government under this administration, led by Jill Biden. Apparently, we're having a nice Woodrow Wilson moment again because she led the cabinet meeting today. And her name was next to Joe's on the presidential seal. Like, just kill me. And but because of that, right? Like, you're seeing, like there's this retaliation to outside threats, and now all of a sudden Elon Musk is getting sued for environmental regulation, so he can't launch his next Starship right away. And even he's realizing, oh shit, human civilization, the way that I see it going, can't exist if like these woke retards are in power. Like, that's a huge problem. And so you're tracing these ideas and you're tracing them along in a way that I think is important for us to discuss. And this is why this book is so interesting to me, because it's taking the spine as a record and talking about, well, what does that mean? And what does it mean that we're here to even talk about it? Well, clearly the biological depth and our ability to perceive time means that, like, oh, perhaps we're trying to escape the like long history of trying to be human and walking on two legs and surviving like getting killed by large cats or something, and like there's stuff there, and that just tickles my fancy, and that's why I
Yeah,
wanted to talk about this.
it's a difference between something you believe in and something you just seem to witness happening. This just seems to be an accurate description, especially given our drive towards space exploration, transhumanism, and enthusiastically separating ourselves from nature. I mean, I don't think it's undeniable that the story of humanity is trying to separate ourselves from nature, even as we seek to hold dominion over it. So that part, at least in the West, like I'm not trying to speak for whatever the fuck goes on in Africa, but let's just, we probably retroactively say that usually when I say these things, I'm referring to the European context and its, diasporas. But yeah, like this is something like this isn't even an ideology. It's just describing the nature of humanity and what that means. And again, to circle back to, the accelerationist outlook, it's like the idea of trauma, it's not something you just complain about. People will hear trauma and think of it in the context of psychiatry, psychology. It's like, oh, it's something you obsess over. It's more about these things that have impacted you that do guide you, and you can't ignore them, because ignoring them doesn't mean you have power over them or you aren't affected by them. So this idea that a great amount of your life is the category of traumas is to try and say, like, how much of your existence is beyond your control. And at the very least, if you turn inward and identify that, you can seize control of yourself. That really was what psychiatry was trying to do. And of course, we are in no way endorsing the therapeutic state. We are Thomas Zaz respecters around here. But, there is a distinctly European drive to understand oneself and to probe one's own depths. And I think that's kind of what you're trying to do here in a very, very metaphysical way. It's trying to say, like, how much of what I am is we're using that word trauma a lot, but how much of that am I unaware of, but I'm trying to understand it to get back control and maybe make myself, what was the McLuhan, not auto amputation. Yeah, maybe like reverse auto amputation in some sense.
Yeah, and I think that's something to seriously consider is that the history of ideas, or even the history of like ourselves, especially like if you don't believe in anything, like if you're not a particularly religious person, like this can drive you up a wall, right? And I mean, there's some things that will drive you up a wall even within religion, like trying to understand the fall, or the nature of your own salvation, or the nature of like the existence in samsara, or trying to achieve enlightenment. All those things, right, can also drive a person up the wall, but that requires a pedigree of faith. And I do think that we as humans, and again, this is my Christianity speaking for itself here, but because we as a species are an incarnational species, we live incarnate. The fact that we exist in these networks of information and traumatic experiences, and I'm meaning this in the term of like psychic damage, especially on like the Twitter timeline or the headlines of information, clogs up not just the noosphere, but also it affects the nous, it affects the heart, it affects the soul. And a lot of this information is attempting to draw you out from your body, and is trying to draw you exactly in that prosthetic, brain, that cranially outsourced mechanism, or that other neural net that's outside your brain. And so again, that leads to people living very discarnate lives. And you can't just live as spirit, or as soul, or as mind, or whatever you want to prefer it to, because again, your body is just as important as it is to maintaining yourself, but also in your actions, because we're driven by impulses and passions and dark fantasies that can affect us. And when we live, discarnately, that allows us to live in a world where we functionally don't exist in the body. And we aren't dead to the world as in the traditional sense. We are dead to ourselves because we've opted to kill it for some kind of digital, prothesis, and that prosthetic way of existing will drive a man mad, because then all of a sudden you snap back to reality, so to speak, when the internet goes off, or you get banned again on Twitter or something, and you realize that you spent most of your time living a rather discarnate existence. And most people, I think, really don't consider how much of an impact that has on your body or your own being, especially not just like your heart, the nous, the soul, the heart of it all, but also just the way in which you perceive the world. There are so many people I know who are so terminally online that like their form of escapism is that like digital prosthetic. And rather than looking around them and seeing what they can actually do, and it creates like analysis paralysis, it can create existential dread, or the black pill, which has led people to redact themselves. And it's a terrible way of living. And anyone that I think would consider that, like, to reference J.G. Ballard, I mean, like, the greatest atrocity exhibition is like referencing like the Solion test. It's like, oh, you tweet about how you're like a depressed like leftoid. Like that's an atrocity in and of itself, because you've allowed yourself to live in that world. And in doing so, it is drowned with your own thoughts and with your own externalities of time and the perception of time, whether it be climate change or overpopulation or all these dystopic top-down messages that have been brought on by the regime. And all that you want to do is just like get your dopamine high and like act like you're just some little mouse utopian experiment where you're just going to like kill, screw you, I got mine, I'm going to like just goon into like non-existence. That's terrifying. And that's so depressing. And it's just like, there's so much more to it than that. But it's important to recognize that on a historical lens, that when you get people, and this isn't the only time that this has happened, I'm very much I'm not fully a cyclical history guy, but like you can see a lot of it. There are cycles where once that level of externality affects the population to such a degree that they're willing to just roll over and accept defeat or welcome the invader with open arms for the sweet release of death, that's collapse. Whether it happens in our lifetime or several generations from now, that's collapse. And that's the end of things. And that will be marked on some political or ideological or even biological record, whether it be a bottleneck event, which I've talked about in previous videos that we are in one, or it will be written into the fossil record of our bones. And you will see that. And you will become what those bones are one day, and be prepared for it. That's a long-winded rant, I guess, that I've gone on, and I don't know what to really say about it.
That would be a very vibrantly hued way to end this video, but I do feel like I just need to cast a spotlight on some of these comments. I got one from CG Constantine here. I don't know if Dimes is noticing the spinal jokes, and buddy, I do notice them all, and I'm sweating. It took every muscle in my body not to really dive into these. I just got a few here. What do we got here? My spine is my fourth leg, says Mr. Anxiety Floppa. TB88 says the virgin wine ant versus the Chad spine ant. This is good stuff. I'm loving what I'm seeing here. CG Constantine says my spine understands cubic time. A lot of time cube stuff in here. It's been like 45 minutes of time cube.
We're gonna need a whole like 20-minute real secret coffee hours on the time on the time cube.
Tree Surgeon says Marxism is all Gnostic spines. This is what we play for. I'm loving all this. What else we got here? Baby's got back pains. Trauma's gay, says Mr. Anxiety Flop. But that is true. Vulpus persona, spinal fash. Love it. A lot of spinal tap stuff in here. Biped cubist chud, says Woodpit 420. I can go on. I could go on for hours on this. Freud cube law. Just, I'd love to just like publish this chat as something and just bring this to the people living on the North Sentinelese Island and say, there you go. There's a civilization. A good question from our friend over at 2-Bit Podcast, Jason. He asked, did Prude get permission from his priest to read this text?
No. I told him I was going through it, though. I gave him a short rundown, and he was like, that sounds very interesting, but also really depressing.
I had one comment here. I forget who it was, but it just scanned past it. But it was hearing all this, they keep adjusting their posture as they're watching this video.
Yeah, I actually have been like cracking my back as we've been doing this. I need to get a better chair now that I'm thinking about it.
Being a millennial, an older millennial, you're very conscious of the noises your spine makes.
Oh, I'm very conscious of like I never want to wear like over the top headphones because you see all those like professional streamers and they've got the little divot in their like cranium, and it's just like, and you notice it with like the bald soillennial types where it's just like, oh no.
See, one of the funny things about when you have a baby, a newborn baby, it's that one of the reasons you need to keep them up and moving is because if they're stationary on their back for too long, they get something called flathead, where their skull is so soft it'll just be a flat thing, and then you got to give them a special fucking helmet to correct it. But I guess most streamers have like adult onset flathead or microphone head.
Basically, so yeah, like you can see it in certain types. But I just again. You know, they had all those memes about here's what gamers will look like in the future, and I'm like, oh, the headphone thing where like there's like a slightly like divot in the middle of the skull, and I'm like, oh, that one's becoming real.
You know, I don't think there's a way you can leave this video without hating your spine. You're aware of it, and you realize that it's in some sense your enemy. I despise my spine after reading this book.
Yeah, I'm a fan of thinking about, my back hurts. This is a problem. This is a millennia-long conflict with my fact that I'm walking and my endocrine system is like, release the hormones that are going to dull the pain ever so slightly, and then be sure to buy yourself some nice Ben Gay afterwards. And I say this all at the same time. I jogged 3 miles this morning, and I was thinking to myself, in part because I'm trying to lose some weight, but also at the same time, I want to run a half marathon next year. And it's just like, I'm now thinking about bipedal motion and the fact that we rely on momentum to maintain it, and don't lock your knees and all sorts of stuff. It's fun. It's fun.
By the way, we have one super chat from someone we both know, but I actually don't know how to say his fucking name. How do you say that?
This is Luthemplar.
There is no human entity, just human cubics. Try to discuss nature's time cube, and your evil teachers will not allow you. Ignorance of time cube dooms humans. You are a slave. Hallelujah. Larger time cube event. Why not cube? A lot of good words, a lot of good sentiments right in a row. Oh, so here, Vulpus Persona. I love my spine. It always has my back. Yes. No notes.
No notes required.
I'm getting a lot of hell yes moments, one right after the other now.
That's very true. That's a lot of words. Cubic time. You guys are going to definitely... All right, well, Real Secret Coffee Hours times. We got to do a time cube episode.
I do. I mean, I've got the link to it. I might make a real meal out of this if it is as big as I'm hearing. Because I thought I could make a meal out of like... What was it? There was like a flat Earth theory that's called like New Zealand theory or something like that. I'm like, this is going to be really crazy, and then it's like, no, that's just where the Illuminati live. It's like, oh, like no. Sometimes I love conspiracy theories. They build them up to be bigger than they are, and it's just like a paragraph. It's like, okay, well, damn.
You were hoping for more.
Oh, yeah. Wow. That was the thing. That was the thing about like even William, like David Icke, where he's got these like tomes of books, and you're getting into it thinking you're going to get a lot of data and information. And it's more like, this is a lot like the movie The Matrix, and they just describes the Matrix for a few pages. It's like, okay, you're a guy who likes movies, and you said, yeah, I saw Dune, and I started thinking that maybe we're in Dune. That's David Icke for you, the fucking phenomena of conspiracy theories.
All sorts of wild stuff there. Wild stuff indeed.
Wild stuff. Anyway, I'm sure we have to probably get going now. This has been a phenomenal episode. I had a great time talking about this. I like talking about it more now than when I did it on Blood Satellite. And I think, you know, it does need to be a multi-part episode because we just set up a lot of stuff, but it gets even wilder if you can believe that.
Yeah, no, it's going to get wilder. I edited in post the description, so this will probably be part 1 of 3. So we'll see how far we get into um, something to get into. I think in the future, now that we've kind of outlined some stuff, because I'm referencing intelligence and escape, our own existence and consciousness. There's so much more that I'm just like teasing out that needs to be fleshed out more. So, but what we're going to do, we're going to probably end it here tonight. And there will be probably 2 more episodes to cover the rest of the text in general. But Dimes and I are going to do this regularly. This is going to be like a monthly deal or a quarterly deal. It's called Do You Even Read? We want to cover literature in the way that every time that Dimes and I get together to talk about something, it just turns into like a lengthy bibliography of references, and I enjoy that shit very much. So we're gonna do more of it in the future.
And my dream is to take some more of the more fringe or weirder or crazier stuff that no one else has covered, because sometimes on the show we'll cover things that other people have covered, but you know, there's not a lot of people talking about this or the things we've covered in the past even. So it's going to be really cool.
Yeah, and I'm really looking forward to it. So it's going to be a lot of fun. But we're going to probably end it here. I'm going to refresh entropy. This is your last time for questions or things to annoy us with. I'll read some more jokes in the meantime. But I didn't have no idea what was happening half the time tonight. Well, it's okay. You'll learn to enjoy it, I think, in the future. There'll be plenty more for us to break down.
We'll have a spinal. I feel like the spinal thing is going to be a recurring callback. People are just saying, yeah, I'm having a real spinal time right now.
Yeah, I have a feeling there's going to be a lot of that in the future. Tree Surgeon. I have the link on my Telegram page. If I might just upload it to like a mega upload. I have the PDF. So I will just happily make it available to you all, because I'm a firm believer in piracy is not a crime. That's just my opinion.
We should actually just call this ongoing series Time Cube Spine.
Yeah.
I'm just writing time cubes. I don't know where I'm going to do it. Maybe that's a mug. Maybe that's a tattoo. I don't know what it is, but Time Cube Spine just speaks to me.
Time Cube Spine. It's a good one. I'm going to have to do it. It'll be fun. All right. Well, let me refresh entropy one last time, and then I think we're going to just call it there. Dimes, where can people find you?
Yes, you can go to bloodsatellite.ca. I'm on X at Legally Ironic is the title. You can listen to Blood Satellite, the show, on Spotify, wherever you find your podcasts. We're also on YouTube. Look up Blood Satellite clips on there. And I'm also on Substack. So we have, it's, of course, written stuff, not the podcast, but actual articles, vanguardistjournal.substack.com. That's the URL.
Well, there you go. I will make sure that those links are put down in the description. I will also try and find a way I can upload this to, say, the community forum. I'll probably just do that. But I hope that everyone takes very good care of your back. I hope that you have an excellent mattress and things like that. Meme magic is real. We just created another meme for the Prudentialists and Blood Satellite spheres. That's very true. Very true. And be sure to subscribe to Blood Satellite. My favorite part is of all the paid content is the Real Secret Coffee Hours. I like listening to an angry man read Substacks angrily. It's a great time.
And I never start off angry. I start off really gregarious, but then you watch me get there.
Oh, I know. It's perfect.
I just become unhinged. Like, anyway, thank you very much for that endorsement. It means a lot.
But with that, ladies and gents, yeah, good posture literally can change everything. And I hope that you all have good posture and that you all have an excellent time. 33 vertebrae. It's not a conspiracy or anything. Yeah, almost as if, pay attention to the Almighty.
Let me just say one thing, because you gave me so many compliments. I just wanted to say you're the best showrunner. I don't even need to give you compliments, Mr. Just crossed 12,000 subs, right?
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
you're the big shot, so I'm just letting people know.
It was a good. It was a really good Friday because I crossed 30K on Twitter and 12K on YouTube. So like this was a great Friday for me.
Yeah, it's Friday, Garfy baby.
It is Friday. Onwards and upwards. Life's gonna be good. But with that, we will continue this later on in the future. I hope that you all have a good night, a good spine. Stay spinal, stay spiny, baby. Spinal Chad-tastrophe. This is so bad. This is the definitive take, and chat has just derailed us. My chat, you've ruined me. It's like that scene from Pig Hag. My gaze, you've ruined me. It's so true. I've been ruined. All right. Well, with that, I'm gonna get us the heck on out of here. So, stay safe. The spine is real. Focus your energy towards the cube. We can end it all here. Good night, guys.